Hello, and welcome to, well, a long patrol, a recorded video, about a what if, for Patron 70. Because Colin Cameron proposed this question, and it won. Actually, both got 9 votes. There were roughly 20 options, and both received, the winners this month received 9 votes. I've either got to start cutting down the options if I want to see it, if I want to be able to say grander things of people having more votes for them for winning, or I've got to seriously up my numbers of patrons somehow, but that will probably get me more suggestions. It's a good problem to have. It's definitely a good first world problem to have. So Germany does not invade Belgium in 1914, so UK does not declare war. How does this affect the Royal Navy? Well, I have to say I've adapted this question. In that, mentally I have thought about this question as, so the UK does not declare war because of this. However, there are still the circumstances where the UK could declare war. But it's important to go through. And it's actually kind of an interesting question to get into the year of technology, because we are so used to thinking of technology as this thing which almost takes place separately, this amazing technological growth, these things happen, it's just amazing, when actually often technology is a product of the time, and the emphasis that's been put into it, and the needs that are at the time. So at the moment, we are seeing a bit of a space race developing. But that space race is between billionaires who are seeking larger and larger rockets that are honestly not symbols of anything else in order to reach space. This is done often suggested to be about an ego, but often there is also quite a large financial dimension in this, in that those who get to space first will have access to all the resources that are available in space. And let's be honest, even in terms of the solar system itself, the system around our sun, those resources are as near enough infinite to our needs at this current time. They are overwhelming. So therefore, infinite riches. In this period, they are working on a lot of armor plate, and the fact is, armor plate technology and gun technology is moving forward at a heroic pace. A heroic pace. And sometimes you get questions and comments from people who go, oh, well, you know, this ship must have been this type of ship because look at how it stood up to the guns of so-and-so at this point period. But the point is, those guns might be smaller than the ones it was originally designed to deal with, but they are far more powerful than the equivalent 8-inch gun, let's say, in terms of Japanese battlecruisers / fast battleships of the Congos. And their performance in World War II. No, they are hit by 8-inch shells and 6-inch rounds at far closer ranges than they were designed to be fighting at. Virtually point-blank ranges in terms of naval gunnery. And the guns that they are being hit with are far more powerful and capable than the equivalent 8-inch gun of their period had been, when they've first been built. These two factors mean that some of the explanation for why their system goes down, and therefore you can start calling them weak, goes away. The fact is, battle cruisers were supposed to be able to stand up to the firepower of cruisers. So the very fact that a cruiser is penetrating even a battle cruiser's armor at that range tells you that there's a problem. A battleship which would have had more coverage, but probably just as thick armor, but the armor would have covered more space, would have been just as badly damaged. And a fast battleship is somewhere between a battleship and a battle cruiser. Especially when you're dealing with things which are, for want of better words, conversions. Now, when we're talking about this particular question, and I'm going to do a shameless book plug, because, you know, I'm doing shameless plugs of my books at the moment because I am writing more books, and all the funds I get pretty much go into book writing, food purchases, because I like to eat, like to live, and at the moment sorting myself out and prepping for the Australia trip, which I'm going to make an announcement about later on this month, hopefully. And, well, to be honest, research trips. I don't have a social life. I have naval history. It's easier and less complicated this way, but it isn't cheaper. It isn't. You'd think it would be, but honestly, books are more expensive. And they're not self-propelled. Terrible. So why does the question make sense? And why is it worth, therefore, looking at? I always apply this sort of system when I'm looking at, especially what-if questions, which I put in Patreon. Whether I sort of go, no, we can't do that one, or we can. This one makes sense because there are actually quite a lot of issues going on. There are actually quite a lot of potentials of Germany not doing this, and of Britain not getting involved, or Britain choosing to get involved in a different way. Because neither are of one mind. Neither country, neither government is of one mind. Both have a lot of conflict going on, a lot of debate going on. Kaiser Wilhelm himself, who is an idiot, let's be honest, he is an absolute moron. And that's me being nice about him. Sorry, the moment you start believing your own press, you become instantly a moron. You should. The first rule of life: never believe your own press. If people keep walking up to you and telling you how amazing you are, accept it graciously. Don't believe it, because there's always someone better than you. Don't believe you are the greatest thing since sliced bread. You're not. Sliced bread still is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It really is, especially with beans on toast. And cheese. Always add in the cheese. And this is the point. There is, though, a lot of variety going on in the various governments. There are a lot of attempts to try and stop war between Britain and Germany. Why? Because they realise how bad that war would be. Good point to make is that Britain had pretty much won the naval arms race versus Germany. Now, they were still in a technological naval arms race with Italy and America. And I know that's always a shock to people when they go, well, they can understand America being involved, but they go, Italy? Italy is pushing forward the bounds of naval technology. The ships they are building are going to be next generation. They are going to, in fact, they are going to be the closest peers of the Queen Elizabeth class in service. Their next generation of dreadnoughts. They are really something special. You have to always remember the naval race, the naval arms race, is a lot more than just Britain and Germany, and it is a lot more complicated than just Britain and Germany, because also you have to add on Japan. And Japan is also pushing forward technology. They are growing up slower, but they are just as much of an also-ran as Italy in that naval race. But the only difference is, Italy stops building during World War I. Japan carries on. Italy can't because they're the ground war they're fighting as the Austro-Hungarians. The Japanese can. And yes, neither of them has massive infrastructure, but they're still building, still pushing technology on. And that's one reason why the Americans are still building dreadnoughts. There is no reason the Americans need to bring dreadnoughts into World War I. The Royal Navy has enough of them. But they're building them because these nations are still building them. And because Britain's still building them. So naval race, the Anglo-German naval race probably ends in about 1913. You can say by the beginning of 1914, frankly, the Germans, for all their bluster, are out of it. They are still building ships. Yes, they're still making a big fuss, but the numbers they're laying down, Britain has got. They've gone from being able to sort of building a 1-to-2 ratio almost of British ships to the British are building 8 R-class battleships, and we might consider when we look back from World War II eyes. We don't think of the R-class as being great ships. That's because they were difficult to upgrade. They didn't have as much space as the Queen Elizabeth. They weren't as fast as the Queen Elizabeth. They were all these things. All true. But during World War One, they were the bee's knees. They were really, really good. For World War One dreadnoughts, the R-class are friggin' good ships. And Britain's building 8 of them. And they're building 6 Queen Elizabeths. And they're building battle cruisers. And they've still got all the other ships. And what are you building in contrast? Are you still a risk fleet when your enemy force out of quality units outnumber you by that much? You start having to look at a different plan. So let's look at the Schieffelin plan, which is, of course, the reason why Germany goes through Belgium. But the reason Germany goes through Belgium is because of issues. They are going round problems, and problems I'll discuss in a bit. It comes back to the Franco-Prussian War and the legacy of that. But basically, they see Belgium as the soft touch to go through. And why is Belgium a problem for Britain if you go through Belgium? Because, believe it or not, if you want to actually invade Britain, there are a few good ports on the Channel coast. A few good places. The Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, was lucky in that he was actually in one of the few good spots. The other good spots are all in Belgium and the Netherlands. Those are good places where the tides and the currents and tends to be the wind patterns will actually assist your attempts to invade Britain. This is why the British have a habit of getting very, very worried about the Danish fleet, the Dutch fleet, and any French forces north of Calais in the Napoleonic Wars at any point in history. This matters to Britain. And honestly, Schieffelin probably understood this. But when he was coming up with this plan, and there is a point to this, Britain was being treated very differently than when the plan was executed. For starters, Schieffelin was dead when this plan was executed. He died in 1913. He left office, his post as Chief of Staff of the German Great General Staff, Chief of the German Great General Staff, roughly translates to his title was, in 1906. The naval race had really heated up since 1905. Up until that point, honestly, it wasn't much of a naval race. Yes, the Germans were building up pre-dreadnoughts, or as I like to call them, sovereigns. But there weren't that many they could do. The British already had such an advantage in terms of numbers, it wasn't really noticeable. And the British could easily have built and matched more. Like they did with the R-Class, they could have been churning out sovereigns from dozens of shipyards. And yes, it would have cost money, but they could have done it. However, things got worse. And the hoped benevolent neutrality of Britain didn't exist. There's also the fact that there's been the Entente Cordiale agreed. There's been the Russo-Japanese War. There have been all sorts of things going on. And most importantly, there has been Kaiser Wilhelm being Kaiser Wilhelm. I.e. making a nuisance of himself. Making grandiose statements. Combine this with the Navy laws and various other things going on, and suddenly Britain, even though there is a naval race going on with, to an extent, with Italy, with Japan, with America, there is no heat in those races. Those races are technological one-upmanships. Those are, honestly, they're the equivalent of the sales team but getting themselves every time they get a new flashier car. We all know the generic idea. You have a sales team and they like to show off who got the biggest bonus by who has the biggest, newest, flashiest car, sort of thing, and which is more expensive. And they're having all these sort of debates which is better. The thing is, that's the kind of thing where everyone's in sort of that friendly rivalry. It's not going to lead to war. It's not going to cause your sales team to start fighting or split your force. It's going to carry on, but it's not going to cause any trouble. It's happened. It's part of naval technology quite a lot. What makes it different is when I don't know how to explain it. Let's say two of those members of the sales team buy houses opposite each other in the same street. And it turns into them hosting parties at the same time, them hosting everything at the same time to compete with each other and try and draw each other, as one tries to upset the other. Basically, let's say one's the senior team member and he always has a party that year and his car is always there and all these things, and you've got the other one who's, well, making lewd remarks about his daughter and trying to host a party at the same time, and it's how you get a grudge going, basically, and that's the difference. The naval race between Germany and Britain becomes a grudge. Despite that, the navies retained very professional relationships. And honestly, there is still a lot of good relationships going between Britain and Germany. It's more of a grudge, but it's still not necessarily going to lead to war. It's the sort of thing which leads to annoyance, not to people, maybe water balloons, but not actually anyone getting out anything more than that. Maybe a BB gun. And you have the fact that in 1901, between 1898 and 1901, Joseph Chamberlain had negotiated with Germany for a potential alliance. We think of the Anglo-Japanese alliance as the first alliance. Yes, that's the first alliance which agreed, but it's not the first one which had been negotiated for. Britain had considered allying with Germany. They had, but Germany's terms were onerous. Germany wanted to be the dominant power. They didn't even want an alliance of friendships. They wanted an alliance where they would tell Britain what to do. Because they were the coming new power. They were powerful. It doesn't work like that. Britain might agree to an alliance of equals. But as tradition, Britain tends to ally with the smaller powers against the bigger powers and use its wealth to form a coalition of small powers to offset the power of the larger powers. It's how Britain works. It's been our diplomatic track record for several centuries. It's worked very well, thank you very much. Now, the Entente came about not because of, I would say, a growing love between Britain and France, despite several members of the British royal family's work on that front, and various francophone members of British society being very keen on that. It largely came about because during the Russo-Japanese War, where France is allied with Russia and Britain's allied with Japan, there's a very real realization that there could be war between the two powers because of the other two powers fighting. And they thought they'd better solve things out so they can minimize that risk. So they got together and had many agreements. But crucially, as one British diplomat put it, the fundamental fact, of course, is that the Entente is not an alliance. For purposes of ultimate emergencies, it may be found to have no substance at all, for the Entente is nothing more than a frame of mind, a view of general policy, which is shared by the governments of two countries, which may be, or become, so vague as to lose all content. You might ask, why would the British do this? They've got a proper alliance with Japan. Why are they only doing an entente with France? The answer is Russia. The answer is Britain doesn't trust Russia. And at this point, you wouldn't either. Russia has a habit of keep launching wars which they militarily can't do and they get in trouble with. They think they are an all-conquering power, and certainly the small nations they are, but they also keep taking on the medium-sized nations, i.e. Japan, and having a terrible time of it. Because it turns out Japan has actually managed to modernize properly. And keep picking fights in Europe with Austria and Germany, which Britain doesn't want to be drawn into if it's just Russia being Russia. Especially not when the Russians also keep looking at Afghanistan and various other places as routes to India. For some reason the British don't want to share a border between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. They don't like that idea. And they like to have buffer states between the two. You can argue quite a lot of problems in the modern Middle East are down to that desire. Yes, we have to live a loggered legacy of this era. And a lot of countries and a lot of maps have their lines drawn on them by this era. So it's worthwhile remembering that it is never straightforward. There's also this, the Franco-Prussian War. The fact is, Germany had to fight France in order to form itself into a united country. There have been two countries who'd really not wanted a united Germany. Austria and France. Britain was agnostic at best about it. On one part, it would raise a massive power in the centre of Europe, which would be a problem. On the other part, it would raise a massive power in the centre of Europe, which would keep Russia and France occupied in Europe and allow Britain to focus on the rest of the world. It's never a straightforward answer in international relations. Any day where you can give a straightforward answer in international relations, the odds are it's a day where a lot of people have got killed. So we prefer them being nuanced and contextual and complicated. Now, of course, during the Franco-Prussian War, this is what had happened. Start off here, you can see the bit that's Germany, and the bit that's France. And ends something like this, where you can see that quite a large chunk of France is now Germany. But they haven't gone into Belgium. The trouble is, the French had learnt from this experience. They lost Alsace-Lorraine. The Germans had celebrated a military parade in Paris. And the French built Verdun. And all the forts like it along that border. Which ultimately is why you have the Schieffelin Plan. Because the Franco-Prussian War has taken out the nice easy route because the French have been beaten up there before, so they've gone, let's build some forts. Seriously, this is the first point at which I would turn around and go with the French in World War II. Why didn't you complete the forts to the sea? I know you were relying on Belgium being your ally, but Belgium had been your ally in the previous war. And look what happened. Build your forts all the way to the sea. Build fortifications all the way along. Do not leave gaps in fortifications. Years and years of people building castles will tell you, you do not leave a gap in your wall. That is where the enemy will come. Usually they decide the gatehouse is the weak point because that is a gap in your wall. Which is why then so many people try and turn their gatehouse into a mini castle on the castle. Turn it into a strong point, but then you've got so much force and money and everything devoted there, other places are usually left weak. Well, This is the problem for Germany. They can't go through the same thing they did in the Franco-Prussian War. There are forts there. And besides, they're fairly certain the French are planning to attack out of there. And the Germans' plan is to hold them there and bog them down with... Well, it changes. There are various ratios put forward in the Schieffelin plan. There are various points believed to be the correct ratios. Schieffelin wanted as many and as much of the force as possible to be part of the right wing, which would go through Belgium, and to leave the bare minimum on the left wing, which would hold up the French. The Moltke the Younger was scared. It's easier to plan these things in academia, but honestly, Schieffelin is far more of a... Schieffelin is... he's brutal. He's far more accepting of the reality of that they're going to lose a lot of people in Germany to win the war overall, to capture the French army and destroy it in entirety. Because that's his plan. That's how he wants to win the war quickly. He doesn't want to destroy France, he wants to destroy its army. The rest can be done easily after you've done that. Going south is not an option to go around the fortifications. There is this place called Switzerland, which is a rather large amount of mountains. And the Swiss might have a lot of German speakers who could be very pro-Germany. However, they are very much more pro being Swiss. And marching your army through Switzerland is not something they're going to be happy about. And they tend to be aggressively neutral. When I say aggressively neutral, there is being neutral going, I don't want to take part in this. And there is being neutral going, I don't want to take part in this. This is the Swiss style of neutrality. It's proficient. It's efficient. But it does mean you don't have that as an option. So what is the German plan if they don't invade Belgium? Because those forts aren't going anywhere, and you can't go through Switzerland. Well, there is actually another option. And bear with me, because it's not the greatest option in the world. Please, there is a reason why Schieffelin doesn't go with this option. But I was having to look as what's another option for them actually. That's a viable option for them winning this war if they don't invade Belgium. It's a case of not have the war, is option one, which means, honestly, nothing much. The Royal Navy keeps building ships, the Germans keep struggling, and eventually there is a war in Europe. But if I'm not going to go through Belgium, if I decide I do not want to risk the British getting involved, and the British will get involved for defence of Belgium, I know that. That's a big thing for the British, and they've told me it several times. It's a big thing. Only someone who is obsessed with their own hubris would not take those statements into account, considering British strategic and military history and the ideas of the government at the time. I have two of the largest merchant shipping lines in the world by tonnage. And in fact, here's the thing. Because of my focus on taking immigrants to America and basically the rules I've set in place as Germany, that mean that virtually anyone who comes across my borders, if they want to do immigration, they have to be going to one of these lines. Because, by the way, the border posts, I have delegated the running of them to these two lines. They run my border patrols. my border posts for new immigrants coming through to take them to America. They have used this cruise line fleet, a huge liner fleet for the transatlantic trade. Fast ships, big ships which take a lot of people and goods. And I do have the high seas fleet. So how about I go round Belgium? I use the Kiel Canal, and instead of going round Belgium and through, I come in and land in northern France. Maybe even southern France. I go completely behind their army. I sucker their army in as much as I can over here, this part of the Schieffelin plan, where the French are attacking. This is the French plan of attack. And my army comes roaring down from the coast. Well, yeah, the French might believe in the Entente Cordiale, but do I believe in the Entente Cordiale? Do I believe if I don't touch Belgium, the British will do anything? And maybe I send the British a note saying, look, I'm going to fight this war against the Germans, but I'm not the French, but I'm not planning on staying there. There are options which I could subtly deploy. Certainly, if Bismarck had been in charge, he probably would have done. These are a lot. There are a lot of these vessels. A lot of these vessels. How big an army can I move? Can I move the sheer amount of force I want to move? Can I move 70-80% of the German army that I want to move? That's a lot of troops. The thing is, the liners don't have to go that far. So if they can arrive, drop off, come back and arrive, drop off, then that works. Yes, I've got to rely on the high seas fleet to pound any fortifications into non-existence. On any port, but there again I have got the second largest collection of dreadnoughts of anyone in the world. There is a sensible plan in there. There is an option. It's not a great option. Please note, I'm not professing this is a great option, but this is the case of you have war, but you don't want to invade Belgium because you don't want to start a war with the British. You're trying to avoid that option. But you can't go south through Switzerland. You can't go through Verdun because you're never going to get your forces through there as quickly as you want to, and you're going to get bogged down. And it's just going to turn it into a meat grinder, which is what you want to do to the French. So you're smart enough to do that. So if you're trying to avoid Belgium, the only option is to go round it. That's the only option. And the fact you have all these ships makes it an option. So this then becomes a big problem for this group. Now, there are many more in the cabinet, and trust me, there are some more personalities in there who I should probably be talking about in terms of British cabinet, but this is not a discussion of the British cabinet at the beginning of World War I. This is a discussion of this is a problem, and as a scenario to consider about. And the Prime Minister and Secretary of State for War at this point was Herbert Henry Asquith. Why he made himself Secretary of State for War? Because he didn't have anyone else he wanted to put in the job. He soon does, but at this point he didn't. At the beginning of World War I, in this sort of time period. You have the Welsh wizard, David Lloyd George, as the Chancellor. Energetic. He doesn't want war because he's worried about the economy. Asquith doesn't want war because he doesn't like war. Churchill, who is full of the Boer War experience, full of national pride, full of, I don't know, national sense of honour. He doesn't want war, but he's the most pro-war of the group if France is invaded. Edward Grey, probably more pro-German than French. Probably works with them better. And certainly tries for various peace options. And then there's the Home Secretary, Reginald McKenna. He's a powerful voice. A powerful voice. Interestingly enough, you can argue that Lloyd George, and studying Lloyd George, is who teaches Churchill oratory. Because Lloyd George is by far the best public speaker of this group. By far and away. If you want to really get chills of some of the of some sort of politicians and their speeches, go and look at some of the remaining reels and some of the accounts of Lloyd George's speeches. Churchill is good. Churchill becomes very good as he goes on and he gets experience, but he comes that way because of who he's prepared to study, and he's prepared to study anyone who can teach him. And he studies Lloyd George, because Lloyd George is by far and away the best public orator, politician Britain has probably ever had. There is a debate between him and Churchill. And I like Churchill. I think he's the only person for the job in some of the scenarios he ends up in. But Lloyd George would probably win on the oratory front. Now, what do they do? What do they want to do? Do they want to fight a war? They know how expensive. All this naval building, all this construction, all these things, it's all been about deterring a war. Successive British governments have been investing as much as they have been to try and deter conflict. The very wording of the Entente Cordiale is designed to give them an out if they want to. That's the reason why it's an entente, not an alliance. The whole purpose is because they don't want an alliance. An alliance could lead to war that they can't control. They've got an alliance with the Japanese, but they're very much the dominant partner in that, and besides, the Japanese are in the Far East, and their likely person they're going to fight is Russia, possibly America, but probably Russia. And if it's America, well, honestly, at this moment in time, the British have good relations with the Americans. So they feel they can probably stop that being a problem. You also have the reality of what is sitting in the English Channel. Remember, the British have started deterring and trying to prepare for a potential conflict. Sounds sensible. But that means most of the Navy is off at Scapa Flow. It's up off in the north of Scotland. It's being prepared for the war plan of the North Sea. You haven't got your mines laid, you haven't got your channel barrier built up yet. If the Germans have got their forces, and you haven't got a BEF sitting in France, and the Germans do a dash down the channel with all their liners and their high seas fleet, what do you have there to intervene if you decide to intervene? You have the Harwich Force and turret, a load of destroyers, some light cruisers, and some scout cruisers, and some submarines. And you have the Channel Fleet under Vice Admiral Sir Lewis Bailey, It's another one of those names you don't hear a lot about in the Royal Navy Mod 1, but you should probably hear more about. Why? Because very few officers would be brave enough to stand up and, when offered to command something else, said, I will stay with my squadron. When you know that that squadron is basically doomed to die. We talk about the Germans bringing their pre-dreadnought ships, their sovereigns, with them to Jutland. Well, his task in 1914, after war was declared, but even before it really, you can argue, was with 16 sovereign, as in pre-dreadnought battleships. He hasn't got HMS Dreadnought. And, 5th Squadron, for example, includes such vessels as HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Bulwark, HMS Implacable, HMS Irresistible, HMS Formidable, HMS London, HMS Queen, and HMS Venerable. Wonderful, wonderful pre-dreadnoughts. Not one of them you'd really want to stand against a dreadnought in. But, that's what he's got. Roughly, 5th Cruiser Squadron has 4 light cruisers with it. Roughly. Between 6th and 7th Cruiser Squadrons, they're giving him 8 more armoured cruisers. 8th and 9th Squadrons have roughly 12 armoured protected cruisers between them. And please note, I'm using roughly because these vessels are in varying states of reactivation from reserve. They're coming from the 2nd and 3rd fleets, the reserve formations. And he's not necessarily getting all the best units for them. And the 10th, 11th and 12th Cruiser Squadrons. 16 protected cruisers. That's his force. So, if you're the British government, and you are looking at it with the Germans coming down the channel to invade France, your immediate stopping force that you've got that you can deploy is this. So what are the options? Well, there's lots of nuance around it. You can go through various options. I could give you a list of a dozen options of various things getting involved. You can not get involved completely. You can monitor the fleet and you can watch them and you can tell the French they're coming. You can do all sorts of things. You can send a diplomatic note saying you should not be using the channel for sending your fleet. But your ultimate options are don't get involved or have a massive battle in the channel. And by the way, one of the curious things about this scenario is if you want World War I over by Christmas 1914, this gets World War I, or what would have been a Franco-German war, possibly, over by Christmas 1914, because it goes very quickly one way, or it goes very quickly the other way. It's not nice. Lots of people will die. The actual less people die is if the British don't get involved. If the British don't get involved, that's probably less people die. If the British get involved, that's a lot of people dead. Why can I say this? Well, I can say this because of the consequences. No battle. Well, the immediate consequence, the Entente dies. Germany probably succeeds in landing. Probably. The reason I say this is because the sheer amount of force they'll be showing up with. The question becomes, you can go on at sort of what point do the British get involved? they even succeeded, but they wouldn't be able to take as many troops with them probably as they did through Belgium. They'd have to go back and get more waves. So it'd be a case of the troops be landing and whoosh forward, and then there'd be another, they'd be coming back and getting more and whoosh forward, and it would be waves of them coming through. Or they'd set up a conveyor line of literally of the cruise liners going backwards, the liners going backwards and forwards. The BEF won't be there. If you don't have control of the channel, and if the German High Seas Fleet is sitting in the channel, you don't have control of the channel, there is no way you can deploy the BEF, even if you wanted to. Until the High Seas Fleet is out of the way. So, sorry British Army, you can't do anything. And that means you're going to have a naval battle in the channel if you want it. And if you don't want to get involved, if you decide they haven't gone into Belgium, they haven't done our lines, which mean we want to go, which mean we have to go to war, and we don't want to go to war, then... Oh. However, the Germans will have trailed not just their battle fleet, but a massive amphibious invasion force off the coast of Britain. Let's go back and think about that government. There's a lot of personalities in there. We know Asquith falls during the war. He's not up to the task. He's too tired. He doesn't have the energy needed for it. And we know Lloyd George takes over. If Asquith makes that decision, Lloyd George doesn't want a war, remember, but Lloyd George is ambitious, but also he's just as proud of his country as Churchill is. There's going to be a case of you have let the Germans... Invading Belgium is a casus belli the British can understand. And British can project. Letting the Germans sail a massive fleet down the channel and launch an amphibious assault into France, even when we don't have alliance but have an entente with them, is going to strike a lot of them as problematic. Which means the British government will probably be actually deluged in internal squabbles for a good few weeks, and I wouldn't be surprised if the government, as in the Prime Minister and the current cabinet, fell, and a new cabinet, new leadership emerged. Probably Lloyd George. Probably Lloyd George. But don't count out Churchill. The Germans have a lot of liners. And if you convert them into fast troop ships, and you are literally carrying them loaded and loaded up with troops, you can do a lot of landings very quickly. Now, you can point to Gallipoli and go, well, look at how bad that was. You would be right. But Gallipoli, as we've often said, they were landing, they'd given them time and warning they were coming, and they landed at the wrong beaches, honestly. And all these things worked against Gallipoli, and the command and control and everything were sort of terrible. The command and control for this operation would not be done right. Let's be honest. The Germans would set up a plan which would involve the army being in charge of it. But there would be a command and control. And it would be a case of turning up, dropping off troops. There would be strategic surprise. And if they waited till war starts and don't invade Belgium, there are issues. You know, if you can get the French to actually invade you by not going into Belgium, you'd have, that's sort of the scenario you'd have to get on. There are issues with this plan, as I've said, but this is the only one where sort of it works and Belgium's not invaded. No battle, long-term consequences. The trouble is, a Germany which wins this war, and please don't get me wrong, the odds are the Germans win it, because all the problems the French have with their command and control at the beginning of World War One, and they still have problems at the beginning of World War Two. It seems to me the French get into a major war, and their politicians spent more time undermining their armed forces than they have actually working with them, and their command and control systems usually suffer because of this. The French would probably, if the Germans succeed in the landing and succeed in their plans, would probably fall. Their army would not be in the right place. And there is the very real scenario that those troops, the German troops, managed to cut off, surround, and destroy the French army in entirety, and France collapses. A reinvigorated Germany might well start building more ships, or trying to get back into the naval race, trying to get back into their position. After all, their navy's just given them a dramatic amphibious assault victory. Under this scenario, I see HMS Incomparable getting built. I also see a battle taking place. A war taking place. It wouldn't be 1914. I doubt it would be even 1918, but I doubt it would get to 1920 without there being a massive war between Britain and Germany. And the reason is quite simple. At a certain point, Germany's going to want more. Kaiser Wilhelm is going to want more. The trouble is the British won't have the French on their side. Probably. And let me explain why I say probably. The British didn't get involved in this scenario because the government fell, but there's a new government. New government creates new promises. One advantage of democracy. There's also the fact it could be new agreements which actually use the word alliance mentioned. And finally, and this is probably the important part, the French wouldn't have anyone else to go to. The same things which happened to France and so on, Russia would go through the same fall. Russia would probably collapsed. Who else could the French ally with to defend themselves against the Germans? They wouldn't have a choice. Now, please note, I don't say these words for fun. I lost a lot of family in World War One. I didn't know them. They were dead long before I was alive, but my family lost a lot in World War One, fighting for the Entente. We lost a lot in World War Two as well. We're that kind of family. We join up in droves, so we tend to lose a few of us. The 3 seagulls on the front of my book represent the 3 of my family who died as Fleet Air Arm pilots. Fleet Air Arm was not the largest of Britain's air services in World War II by any stretch of imagination, and we lost 3 members of the family fighting in it. We lost a lot in World War One. But still, Entente was not an alliance. And a government which wished to, the government which felt that they didn't want to get involved in the fight because they'd already won their battles and their issues with them, and frankly they were more worried about Russia and what Russia was doing than they were about Germany and France having another tiff, as they do use. I can see happening. But battle. Well, the battle doesn't go well for the Germans either. Okay? There is no doubt in my mind that Bailey's force and probably Turret's forces would be wiped out. They will fight hard, but they would be fighting overwhelming force, coming in with nothing in the way of real support. However, they would go down fighting and holding time for the real force to arrive. And that's the one pictured here. The Grand Fleet. The Grand Fleet would be racing south. That's your only option for the Royal Navy. And just as what the Germans were planning to do to the French army, close the gap behind them, take them from all sides and annihilate them, is what would happen to the High Seas Fleet. Now think about that. The Grand Fleet comes in behind them, in the Channel. This is ultimately why the Germans probably really didn't consider this as a plan, because this is what would have happened if the British did get involved. The Grand Fleet comes in behind. The losses that you would hear about at Jutland would be nothing compared to the losses that would take place in the Channel. They would be fighting at far closer ranges. There is no doubt in my mind they would end up having to, because there is not the room to manoeuvre in the Channel. The battle would take place probably somewhere between Harwich and Calais. That sort of band of the Channel area. I've done a couple of simulations. The results usually are, for the Germans, close on 100% of all ships gone. Why? Before you start saying, well, the Germans have these great ships. They can't, to get back to Germany, they have to do a Spanish Armada and go round Britain or go through the Grand Fleet fighting in daylight. They also have merchant ships they're escorting. Yes, there are going to be a large number of liners which are fast ships, but are they fast enough? And there's going to also be other merchant ships which they're going to need to bring with them to carry all the supplies for their army. So they're going to be tied to that convoy. And that also means their forces are probably not going to be necessarily congregated. They might be held centrally to try and deter the Grand Fleet coming in, but still the Grand Fleet is going to be between them and home, and they're going to be fighting in daylight in close quarters. Please don't think this goes well for the Grand Fleet either. The odds of the British are about the odds of the British range between 60 and 70% losses. It's a battle of annihilation, which is really not good. Now, the British, odds are the British actually recover far more, because British ships can limp into Channel ports. They can beach themselves on British beaches. And this is the other thing which causes such a great German losses, because their ships would be beaching onto French or British beaches, which means they're lost. Okay? You beach your ship onto a British or French beach, there are going to be people there waiting to go, hello sir, you're ours now. So the losses, I'm not talking necessarily all deaths, I'm talking in overall force losses. But you're talking 70% of the German army gone, at minimum. You're talking the entirety of the High Seas Fleet gone. Yes, the British will have lost a lot of ships. The British will still have and the French will have lost a lot of ships, because the French ships will have got involved as well. They will probably, the French forces in the Channel will have also been fighting on the British Channel Squadron, the British Channel Fleet, and also probably been ground to something in the first phase of the battle. But war does end by Christmas. Fleet, whatever's remaining of the Royal Navy, and what the Royal Navy's commissioning and launching at this point, which in 1914 is a fairly large amount of ships they've got coming along the line, will probably be sent into the Baltic. And combine that with the blockade and the cutting down of the Swedish trade and the loss of their army, Germany surrenders. War's over. Such a massive, glorious battle. Glorious meaning that you've lost a lot of people, but you've won, so it's glorious. Only thing worse than a battle won is a battle lost. Wellington was very true and very correct when he said those words. I'm fairly sure others have echoed that same sentiment throughout history. I'm bloomin' sure they have. Anyway, long-term consequences. Well, Jellicoe becomes a new Nelson. But also the Royal Navy now needs to do a crash building program from scratch because they've just lost pretty much everything. There is an also interesting scenario in that probably the Royal Air Force doesn't get formed. War's over in 1914. Air power is still coming along. Aircraft carriers, they're going to be something which is going to probably going to appear slowly. Naval aviation won't have the same pace. Submarines, well, they haven't had their great glorious campaign in World War One, so yeah, they're still there and the technology's maturing, but that hasn't been it. And there has been this giant battle between battleships. If he's alive, he's the new Nelson. Actually, I would have to say there's also the chance that he's dead and he's still the new Nelson. In fact, both him and Beatty could be dead. I ran on my system, which I use for this, which is a very basic system. Please note it's another version of Harpoon, which I've got a friend of mine providing an adaptation. So I don't consider it 100% accurate or anything like that. But I ran through 20 scenarios. Him and Beatty both died in 12 of those 20 scenarios. Beatty died in 17. He died in, well, 15. There was one scenario where they both lived. There were two scenarios where Beatty lived and he didn't. There were 5 scenarios where he lived and Beatty didn't. 2 scenarios where he died and Beatty didn't. I think I said earlier. Hood's inshore squadron, which is so critical to the beginning of World War One and to defending the BEF and the Belgium coast and the forces deployed there, they're gone. Most of the forces which we associate with the Channel War, gone. It was quite a sombering experience running through those and working through what the numbers actually meant. But it made me think about how it would have an impact on technology. Long-term consequences, it's going to change things. Because if you think of the power of these ships fighting at long range, then fighting at short range, that's devastating. This will have an impact on ship design. Honestly, the next generation of battleships the British would build after the Queen Elizabeth's would probably be faster, better armoured, and have bigger, more powerful guns. And why can I say that? Because the only way you can react under that circumstance is that way. I'm going to be doing a live of this tonight. I'm recording this on the 12th and this goes up on Saturday. And I can predict some of the questions I'm going to get asked. And I can predict some of the discussion I'm going to have. But ultimately, I will say this. The Royal Navy of whatever would happen if there was a World War II after this one would look very, very different. If there was another war 20 years later, the Royal Navy of that war would look very, very different. There would be undoubtedly, in my mind, no treaty system. After all, having the largest, most powerful navy has just not only won a war, but saved an ally from absolute destruction. The British would not, British politicians, whilst they would forget many things, wouldn't forget that in a hurry. Especially when it comes to the fact that that navy saved them a lot of money. And rebuilding that navy probably got them a lot of votes, because it would be key contracts in key constituencies. As ever it was. Aircraft carriers. Well, I see aircraft still developing, but the pace of aircraft development, that could be interesting, and how aircraft development, how operation of aircraft develops, could be very interesting. And next war? Well, does Japan get involved in World War One in this scenario? Because if the Germany's defeated before Christmas 1914, what's Japan really going to get? A Tsingtao? The Germans are surrendering. There's going to be no siege. British could get the surrender of Tsingtao with a gunboat turning up if the Germany itself was surrendered. All the fighting in Africa, etc., doesn't happen. Gallipoli doesn't happen. You've just had another scenario added into the massive amphibious, to the history and understanding of amphibious warfare, but now it's going to be a case of, if you want to do an amphibious operation, you need the largest fleet. Russia will have had a victorious war. Okay, yes, that war was won by the British fleet, by the Royal Navy, but the Tsar can now crow. He's won a massive victorious war. They might get something in the peace settlement, and he won't have all his people dying and all the issues that build up during the war, so everyone goes home happy and proud with their uniforms and looking smart. So that's interesting for Russia. And the aversion and horror of war that comes out of World War One. The scarring of an entire generation, not just of the people involved fighting, but the people, politicians, etc., leading it, and the issues that leads to for the next 50, 60 years. And the subsequent scarring from World War II, which has foreign issues, won't have a chance to happen. Oh, it will have been a truly brutal fight, but the thing is, it will have been a naval battle. The other interesting potentialities, of course, those same politicians could charge down to the coast and actually see the battle happen. They could see the battle with their own eyes taking place, the ships dying, the crews trying to get to safety, as the leviathans of steel and fury charge on around them. They would probably be affected by that. In both these scenarios, World War One, or as it would be known as a Franco-German War of 1914, would be over fairly quickly. It would either be devastating for Germany or devastating for France. For Germany, with your army so heavily damaged and your navy knocked out, you might well have a different scenario in terms of government. You might have a change in government, you might not. It's going to be interesting. A lot of the blame will probably be shifted to Tirpitz. Although he can point out, I did the right thing. We have cost the British. Look, the Risk Fleet worked. Look how much of the Royal Navy we've taken out. But the trouble is, the plan is predicated on the Russians, the French, and the Americans then turning on the British. But none of them would turn that quickly. The French will be suffering from their own losses, and they're not going to be in a scenario where they want to turn on the British after the British have just saved their bacon. Politically, it would not be sensible. They have enough problems with the Parisians without doing that. The American fleet, as strong as it is not designed to try and operate against Britain. Yes, they could theoretically make it across the Atlantic, but that would not be a good scenario for anything. And of course, the British have actually ships they're building. There are the R's, there are the Queen Elizabeths coming through, which are arguably going to be the two of the most powerful types of dreadnought in the world. The British won't be fighting a long war. They've got to build a whole load of new ships. Anyway, yeah, it'll take them a while, but they'll be probably churning out, make another order of another 8, and another order of another 8, and they'll have another 16 dreadnoughts in 3-4 years. Because the British government will spend that money. Because they've just seen, perhaps with their own eyes, the value of having the largest fleet. What those ships will be armed with is an interesting question, because the thing is, the Americans building 16-inch battleships, 16-inch guns, they're capable. You either are going to go for 16.5-inch guns in triple turrets, because that's just bigger than the 16-inch, and it would give you enough firepower that you could match up, maybe have 12 guns to their 10, or you're going to go for the 18-inch guns, because the British, again, the competition with Italy, with Japan, with America is over the size of guns and the quality of your ship. It's a qualitative naval race rather than a quantitative naval race. Qualitative naval races rarely cause the trouble of quantitative ones. So, what have we got coming up? Well, first of all, question, and I'm going to ask a question on this one. What do you think that class of dreadnoughts the Royal Navy would build post this Channel battle would look like? What do you think? Do you think, because there is a debate in my mind as to whether or not they end up designing battleships for short-range engagements or long-range engagements after fighting such a battle. They could decide no one else will ever be stupid enough to do such a thing again, so there's no point designing around it. That does feature quite heavily in my mindset. But I'd like to hear what you think. What have we got coming up? We have, well, I put in some of the videos plans. I haven't put in the plans for the 2nd of March and 23rd of March because I'm not deciding yet. 19th of March. Currently that's live, put down as the Battle of Yemen. that could be alive. It might have to change to a long patrol, a recorded video, due to birthday party events in family birthday party events. It should be a luncheon, which should be fine, but I am checking on that one because it's one I can't really get out of. 15th of January we have Brew Ships 98. 19th of January we have Patron 71. Bijons, French interwar carrier aviation. Why did the French Navy not more fully embrace carrier aviation after World War I? That should be an interesting discussion. Because the French have a habit of going after such technologies, and yet naval aviation they really don't push for. 26th of January, I've currently got penciled in the story of the First Fleet founding of Australia. Got to change it to the founding. I was left it as founding of Australia. 2nd of February, we have the Dragonfly class and other gunboat service in World War II, because I thought it'd be interesting to look at gunboats in World War II and, you know, what their actual experience was as opposed to World War I, and where they were useful and where they weren't. 5th of February, Brew Ships 101, Where Are the Dalmatians? I only have a poodle and a corgi, I don't have a Dalmatian. It's terrible, and I'm doing 101. And then we have the patrons and brew ships and all the other things going on. We had the bombardment of Elwood, which I thought you might find interesting. So, and the 30th of March is going to be what I'm calling the patron bonus. I'm going to look through the patron questions of the last few months, and I'm going to pick one, which we haven't done, but which I think would be quite cool. And if we ever have a 5th live in a month, that's what I'm probably going to do as a habit. And we've got steam engines next week as the recorded video for Tuesday, and that's going to be followed by the great ships, 1st, 2nd and 3rd rates in the 18th century. They're good ships. They look cool. They really do. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.